Hi, I'm Peter Andras. I'm professor at Edinburgh Napier University. This is my lecture series on the evolution of complex systems. This is lecture 6, Brain and Mind. This is part 1 of the lecture 6. So in this part, we will look at subsystems of the nervous systems, how the brain is structured, how in particular sensory and motor subsystems work, and we will consider the information subsystem of the brain, which is the memory and the language. So, previously, we looked at organisms and the nervous system, and we said that the nervous system itself, it is the information subsystem of the organism. Now, we will look at this nervous system in more detail. The neurons are the fundamental building blocks of the nervous system. So these are the cells which specialize to deal with information about the organism. So these collect the information through sensory neurons. These process this information, and they also deliver the actions of the nervous system onto the organism by communicating with cells within the organism which implement these actions, such as muscle cells, secretory cells, and other cells. Now, the neurons use their own special communications. Again, these are cell-to-cell communications, where the neurons release neurotransmitters in most of the cases. There are also other cases where they have electric junction molecules which allow passing on of ions between neurons. But in most cases, the communications between neurons are mediated by the release of neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters are released at the axonal buttons of the neurons. They typically travel through a synaptic cleft, the small space where the presynaptic neuron connects to the postsynaptic neuron. The axonal button connects to the postsynaptic dendritic spine. And the released neurotransmitters are passed on through the space, through the diffusion, and connect to the receptors on the dendritic spine and trigger changes in the postsynaptic neuron. Now, the communications happen by triggering the release of neurotransmitters. And these communication actions are the patterns of change of potential difference between the inside and outside of the neuron along the axons of these neurons. Depending on how this potential difference change travels along the axon, on that depends how neurotransmitters are released at the axonal buttons. There are two major ways of the traveling of activities along the axon. So one is the gradient potential, when there is a change of certain pattern which travels along the axon, or the spikes, which are very stereotyped versions of the gradient potential, where the potential difference changes from about -70 millivolts to +20, then goes back very rapidly to -90 and then back to the -70. Now, these the two ways of communications of actions along the axon trigger the release of neurotransmitters at the end of the axon, at the axonal buttons. Now, how much of neurotransmitters are released depends on how these potential changes are organized, for example, on how many spikes follow each other, or what is the temporal structure of the spikes that are carried along the axon. So, while the effective communication is in terms of the release of neurotransmitters, you can also see these communication actions as the gradient potentials and the spikes as elemental components which drive the release of the neurotransmitter release. Now, we said that the nervous system is the information subsystem of the organism. So this is in the sense that some sensory neurons sense what are the communications between the other cells of the organism. For example, whether the muscles are stretched or relaxed, or whether there are sufficient molecular concentrations in the body, such as oxygen and carbon dioxide concentration in the blood, or acidity, appropriate acidity level in the body fluids, and so on. Now, these sensory neurons pass on their information to other neurons, where this information gets processed, and then based on the processing of the information, we get the response, the actions of the nervous system on the organism, which trigger various actions of other cells, like contraction of muscles. So in this sense, the nervous system does the information processing in the organism, and it is the information subsystem of the organism. Now, in higher animals, this nervous system is organized as nervous tissue, where there are a lot of communications between neurons and much less communications between neurons and other cells. In simpler animals, the nervous tissue is not so organized and not so separated. For example, in hydras, there is a nerve net or neural net, but not really a separated nervous system. Now, the nervous system, as we already mentioned, often has specialized subsystems. For example, the sensory and motor subsystems are such. So, for example, the olfactory system deals with information about concentrations of chemicals in the air or in the water around the animal. Or the visual system deals only with communications about visual information that arrives through the eyes of the organism. Or the motor subsystem deals with only the control of the muscles and the organization of the control of many muscles, which needs to be orchestrated in the right way to deliver the right behavior of the animal. These subsystems have the feature that most neurons in them communicate with neurons in these subsystems, so they are relatively separated, and they may have special patterns of interactions between the neurons that are part of these subsystems. So, for example, the neurons in the olfactory subsystem form particular activity patterns in the olfactory bulbs. In the case of vertebrates, which patterns represent particular kind of molecules present in their environment at certain concentrations. This is very different from how the visual system processes the visual information. So there is a specialization in terms of the information, and also specialization in the way how that information is processed within these subsystems. Now, as I noted, the neurons in the subsystems mainly work together, mainly communicate with other neurons within the subsystem. So this leads to kind of co-localized organization of these neurons. So, for example, in insects, these subsystems are organized into ganglia. So, for example, olfactory lobe, which deals with the olfactory sensory information, or the stomatogastric ganglion, which deals with the control of a part of the stomach, meaning it is a motor control unit of the motor subsystem. So by this organization and spatial co-localization of these neurons, it is supported the interaction between them, and also it supports the separation of the particular nervous subsystem from the rest of the nervous system. In a sense, what you can see is that these subsystems of the nervous system deal with a particular kind of self description of the organism from the perspective of a particular aspect or topic of how the organism behaves. So, for example, from the perspective of olfactory information, olfactory driven behavior, the olfactory nervous subsystem describes the organism. Now, in many animals with large nervous systems and many ganglia, we find brains, which are essentially a collection of specialized major ganglia, together with further components which integrate the specialist ganglia. So, for example, what you see on the screen, on the right side, you see an insect brain of a fly. Then on the left side, you see a brain of a cat. In general, and there are other animals such as octopuses as well, which have brains, essentially collections of major ganglia together, which process the information about the organism. Now, let's have a look at the brains of vertebrates. In general, vertebrates have relatively large brains. They have a brain stem, which is the part of the brain that connects to the brain to the spinal cord. The midbrain, the limbic system, and the cortex. The cortex is the most superficial part physically of the brain. The limbic system sits under it, and the midbrain connects the limbic system with the brainstem. Now, if you look at a sensory system, what you see is that the key components are a sensory ganglion, which quite often sits close to the sensory organ, quite often outside of the brain. The corresponding brainstem nuclei, which process the information coming from the sensory ganglion. There's already some processing within the sensory ganglion. So typically the sensory cells pass on information to some sensory neurons, and then there is some local processing within the sensory ganglion before that information is passed to the brainstem nuclei. Then you have midbrain centers, which deal with more complex, more abstract information about the sensory information. Then limbic centers at the next level. Again, these are representing more abstract way, process more complex information about the sensory information. And finally, the most abstract processing happens in the cortical areas. So, for example, if you take the auditory system, the auditory ganglia are near the ears, and these are the first stage of auditory processing. The cochlear nucleus and the superior olivary nucleus in vertebrates are the next stage, where in the brainstem the information about auditory input is processed. The inferior colliculus is the midbrain center, which provides representation of auditory information, calculates various aspects of localization and other features of auditory information. Then there is the medial geniculate body, the lateral posterior nuclei, and the reticular nucleus, where in the limbic system there is relatively complex abstract processing of auditory information. And finally, it is the auditory cortex where the most abstract processing happens. And this is where the perception of the auditory environment is established in the animal. Now, in general, I notice as you go higher, you get more abstract descriptions and more detailed analysis of the information that is processed. So, for example, if you look at the visual system, in the V1 and V2, so the first visual cortical areas, what we can see experimentally is that these cells are sensitive to variations of light intensities, or dark and bright bars of different orientation with different spatial frequency. These also sense continuous lines and some certain simple contours. So it seems that is the level of abstraction that is represented at the level of the first two visual areas. The V2 and the V4 visual areas deal with color and shape perception. So these are the areas where color information about the visual input and some of the shape information about the visual, whether it's a convex or concave shape or certain patterns in the shape are recognized. Then the V3 and V5 areas deal with motion recognition. So, for example, at this level, it matters how these bars are, how fast they are going, if they are changing over time, what is the direction of their movement, where is the location of the information within the overall visual space, and so on. And then there are further higher areas deal with more abstract information, such as face recognition or motion recognition of animals and so on. So what you see is that, again, what this exemplifies that as you go to higher areas, you get much more complex, much more abstract description with very fine details in them. Now, if you look in the same way in motor system, again, we take the example of the vertebrate brains. You have motor nerve ganglia, which are on the spinal cord, and these control the movement of the muscles. Then there are lower brain centers in the brainstem, where neurons control the neurons in the motor nerve ganglia. And these lower centers integrate to some extent the movement and deliver the orchestrated activity control to the motor nerve ganglia. Then the cerebellum, which is a midbrain structure, deals with fine coordination and fine corrections of movements. And then you have the cortical motor areas in the cortex, which there is very abstract representations of the movement, and ultimately they drive the movement that the organism delivers. However, this driving is filter cerebellum, lower brain centers, and motor nerve ganglia, which implement these abstract representations into actual control of the muscles. So again, what you see is that as you go towards higher areas, you get much more abstract representation of the motor behavior. Now, as I mentioned, there are association areas as well. Perhaps this is an old term. However, it is useful to highlight that these are the parts of the brains which are not necessarily explicitly or mostly involved in either sensory or motor processes. These are the areas which join together the sensing and the action part of the brain and of the activity of the nervous system. Now, actually, a large part of the cortex deals with this kind of association function. So, for example, the frontal part of the cortex is mainly integrating the information from both sensory and motor areas and drives the behavior through this integration. There are such association areas in many animals, especially in animals with relatively large brains. You have more of these areas. Now, as I said, these association areas deal with integration. So, for example, in the case of humans, the area that produces human speech is controlling muscles, but it is also related to the sound perception. It is related with other cognitive processes, and it is a complex part of the brain which generates the production of human sounds that are used for human speech. Interestingly, this is a different area from the area that controls most of the animal vocalizations, for example, the ones that are related to animal emotions. So this area integrates information from many parts and represents this information in complex ways. There are many of these association areas, and in many cases we do not understand in detail how they function. Now, if you look at these subsystems of the nervous system and of the brain in particular, what you see is that they deal with specialized content, specialist information, and they may have a special ways of processing this information. Now, they all use the same basic units, which are the neurons, which communicate by neurotransmitters, using spikes in the case of vertebrates for the communication actions which deliver the release of the neurotransmitters at the end of the axons. However, to note is that there are two major classes of these neurons, the excitative neurons and the inhibitory neurons. The excitative neurons induce further activity in the neurons that receive their output, while the inhibitory neurons aim to block the activity of the neuron that receive their output. So the communications from the inhibitory neurons. Now, within these two major classes of neurons, there are many kinds of different neurons. So these differ in terms of their gene expression profile, differ in the neurotransmitters that they release, and differ in their behavior pattern. Where by behavior pattern we mean how these spikes are structured in time. In response to certain spatial temporal patterns of the input that they receive from other neurons. Now, this This specialization means that the, ner- these specialist brain subsystems may have a special language of activity pattern and may use special references in the context of this special language. As I mentioned earlier, for example, olfactory information has a certain kind of representation in the olfactory bulbs and then later entorhinal cortex, and then it gets integrated with many other aspects, for example, with emotions, mating behavior, and many other aspects of the behavior of the organism. Um, if you look at the visual information, again, you see different patterning. So, for example, typically what you find there is kind of retinotopic organization of the higher brain area. This means that a certain part, physical allocation on the retina is mapped onto a certain location within that neural center. And there are other functionally driven organization patterns. So, for example, orientation selectivity, spatial frequency selectivity, and so on, which are organized in certain patterns or if you like maps in the higher brain areas. So, what all this tells you is that there is a specialist representation which uses the same general set of building blocks, but delivers a specialist version of the representation of the information. And correspondingly, there must be a specialist language of the activity patterns that are used in these subsystems. Now, most of the information is communicated within these subsystems, although they get some additional information as well from other areas. But the integration of the information from the subsystems happens within the integrative areas, again, which takes some input from the subsystem and then mainly process that information within these integration areas. So overall, what we see is that both in sensory and motor context, the specialist area subsystems deal mainly with information within the subsystem, and there is relatively low interaction with other neurons outside of the subsystem, indicating that there is a clear system boundary of these neural subsystems. Now, the meaningful communications are the interpretations that fit the specialist model of the system. So as I said, each of these subsystems has a specialization in terms of the information that it deals with, and has its specialist language in terms of activity patterns of neurons. So each of these subsystems represents, if you like, a specialist description or a specialist model of the organism. What are the right olfactory informations and the olfactory behaviors, for example. So the meaningful communications within a specialist subsystem of the nervous system are all those communications which fit this specialist model of the organism. The meaningless communications are the ones which are unsolvable interpretation problems. So these cannot be meaningfully interpreted within the limits of this subsystem using the specialist language of the subsystem in the specialist model. So these lead to identity violations. So, for example, hallucinations are communications between neurons which lead to certain perceptions of the environment which are unreal, which have no actual real basis. So, in that sense, they do not fit the actual description of the environment of the organism. Now, so far we discussed about how the specialist subsystems of the nervous system work. Now let's have a look at the memories of these communications. So we said that the neurons themselves process information about the organism. So if you like, these are memories of what happened in the organism. So for example, the stretch receptor measures the stretching in the muscles and records when the stretching of the muscles happens, communicates this, and this is a memory of a stretching event that happened within the organism. Now, in the same way, because the nervous system communicates a lot within itself, and it has these association areas which join together information from multiple parts of the nervous system, it is possible that some neurons process information about the memories of these communications that happen between the neurons. And indeed, in all higher animals, there are such memories formed about the earlier behaviors within the communication behaviors within the nervous system. So these are memories of patterns of communications within the nervous system that represents previous experiences or previous actions or associations between experience and actions of the organism. And such memories are formed in relatively simple animals, for example, snails, and clearly they are formed in much more complex animals. So, what we have here is the information subsystem of an information subsystem. So the nervous system is the information subsystem of the organism, but it has its own information subsystem, which is the representation of these memories and the interaction between the memories. So the interaction between the memories is processing information about the nervous system. And this constitutes the information subsystem within the nervous system. So, for example, when an animal aims to move, the animal typically plans in advance the motor actions that lead to delivery of this move. And this happens as a virtual planning of actions using the memories of past behaviors, motor behaviors. Or assessment of new perceptions is based on assessment of new perceptions in the context of past perceptions. So it uses and relies on past memories of the nervous system. So in general, the processing of all these memories within the nervous system constitutes the information subsystem of the nervous system itself. Now, there are the communications between the neurons which get representation as memories of these communications. Now, the communications between these memory representations of the communications are the short-term memories of the organism. So these are short-term plans of what the organism is aiming to do or aiming to interpret about their sensory environment. These communications between the memories and the interpretation of motor plans or sensory experiences deliver short-term memories which exist for a short period of time. The memories of communications between memories. So all these communications that involve memories, there are memories of all these communications, and these are the long-term memories of the organism. So these are the memories of how memories are processed. And these are abstract and complex representations of the experiences and behaviors of the organism. Now, if you look at dreaming in the context of humans at least, but also in other animals where there is evidence of dreaming, one way possibly to see these is that these are communications between these long-term memories, between the memories of memory communications within the organism. Clearly, this is a speculative interpretation. However, it looks like a potentially feasible interpretation of what dreaming is, which is a reprocessing of the memories in some context provided by other memories, and which are all long-term memories. Now, the role of this memory system is to interpret or understand the perceptions and actions generated by the nervous system. So they are the memories of the nervous system about its own past behaviors. And in the context of the organization of these memories, new perceptions and new actions are generated and interpreted. And this is what the memory system or the information subsystem of the brain delivers. Then there are the short-term memories, which are short-term associations between memories from the past. These have a short-term life within the memory system. They exist and they can be remembered for a relatively short time, after which they disappear. However, there are the long-term memories as well, which are, as we indicated before, the memories of memory processing. And these long-term memories are retained over long periods of time within the organism. In the case of humans, they may be retained for decades or for the whole period of life of the individual. These two kinds of memories have different localizations in the brain. Different parts of the brain participate in their creation and maintenance. Clearly, the understanding of this is somewhat limited because the experimental information is limited. However, in the case of humans and vertebrates in general, what we know is that the hippocampus area of the brain is a key component for the short-term memory formation. There's also very likely that some other parts of the brain provide critical information for this short-term memory formation. Certainly, the loss of the hippocampus or damage to the hippocampus prevents the formation of the short-term memories. The long-term memories are assumed to be much more distributed across the cortex. They are retained, and many relevant parts of the brain get activated when long-term memories are active in the brain, including all relevant sensory and motor and other functional parts of the brain. Now, these memories are about the functioning of the brain. So what happens in the brain that is represented as memories, and communications about these memories and processing of these memories is what constitutes the information subsystem within the nervous system. Now, mostly this is the association areas that we mentioned earlier, which process information from many parts of the brain. Effectively, these process information about experiences that happen within the brain. So these are the areas which deal with the kind of long-term memories within the brain. So to summarize, we looked at the nervous system and we noted how neurons are functioning, how the nervous system is organized. We looked at sensory and motor subsystems, and we discussed how these are organized and how you move from low level of abstraction to high level of abstraction in the case of vertebrate brains. And we discussed the brain in general in context of a few animals, and then in more detail in the context of the vertebrates. And then finally, we looked at the memories within the brain, which are the memories of interactions of neurons within the brain. And we discussed how the processing of these memories constitutes the information subsystem of the nervous system, and how we have long and short-term memories, at least in vertebrates, but most likely in other animals as well, which support the processing of information about the nervous system. Let's see a few questions. First, is it true that nervous system most animals has a visual subsystem? And the answer is yes. Most of the animals have some visual sensory organ. Typically they have an eye, possibly more than one. Some of them have a larger number of eyes, and these eyes provide the input to the visual subsystem of their nervous system. And that subsystem specializes in processing visual information. Next, is it true that centers of subsystems of insect nervous system are organized in ganglions? And yes, indeed, these, in the case of insects, they are specialized subsystem in their nervous system and in their brain, and the neurons in these are organized in ganglia, which are accumulations of specialist neurons which interact together to deliver their specialist subsystem function within the nervous system. Next, is it true that insects usually have large associative ganglia? And well, we did not mention that this would be the case, and indeed in insects you find mainly large specialist ganglia. Clearly there must be some associative structures. However, these associative structures have not been analyzed in detail too much, and they are not seen as clearly as large associative ganglia in insects. Finally, is it true that visual illusions are meaningful communications within the visual subsystem? And what we said is that the visual illusions are communications that are triggered by wrong interpretation of the visual inputs that the organism receives. These visual illusions the perception implies the perception of things that are not there in the visual system. And essentially they come because of contradictory processing of the visual information. So these visual illusions trick the eye and the visual system of the brain in perceiving things that are not there, and this trick works because there are patterns in the visual information that are interpreted wrongly by the visual subsystem.